Welcome to my coronavirus classroom. My name is Janessa Jacobs, and this is the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is the organ system that houses the functional immune system. So that's an important function, is that it's going to allow for a site of immune system proliferation and activation, but one of its biggest jobs is to return the extra interstitial fluid that wasn't picked back up in capillary exchange to the cardiovascular system. So for functions of the lymphatic system, the really big important first function is it returns fluid to the cardiovascular system. And if you recall, in capillary exchange, we pushed out everything we were going to push out on the arterial side of the capillary bed, and then we only reabsorbed 85% of that into the venous side of the capillary bed. That meant that 15% of that fluid got left there in the interstitial space. So that fluid is going to be picked up by lymphatic capillaries and go through a series of vessels that run past lymph nodes and drain into these things called lymphatic ducts that then drain into your subclavian veins. So that's a really important function of the lymphatic system. And if you don't have the ability to return all that fluid, you start to see what's called edema or swelling in the tissues. So that's a really big important function. Another function is that it actually helps with the absorption of lipids. So there are specialized lymphatic capillaries in your small intestine called lacteals, and they are going to absorb lipids and drain that, or drain all of those lipids into this structure called the cisterna chyli that drains into the thoracic duct. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but that's our next function, is the absorption of lipids. So our lymphatic system absorbs lipids from the small intestine. And then our lymphatic system has things like lymph nodes and tonsils that house white blood cells. So these are sites where we can start an immune response if we need to. So we'll say another function is to act as the site of immune system activation. Those are our important functions. As far as organs and tissues go, the organs are, we have some discrete organs and then we have some diffuse kind of dispersed lymphatic tissue that we find all over our mucous membranes. So let's just jump right in and talk about all of these things. The first of our lymphatic organs are lymphatic vessels, and we have a bunch of different types of lymphatic vessels. The first lymphatic vessel that we'll talk about are our lymphatic capillaries. Those capillaries that are picking up all of that extra interstitial fluid. So lymphatic capillaries originate in our normal capillary networks. If you recall, that figure in your book shows a normal capillary bed, and you can see a little green closed-ended thing sticking up in there. That's a lymphatic capillary. And our lymphatic capillaries, the thing about them is their cells overlap kind of like shingles on a roof. And they're closed-ended tubes with these little filaments that you can find between here. But where our normal capillaries, we had our capillaries, our meta-arterial led into the capillary bed, and then our thoroughfare channel led away. So we had them, and then we had the movement of fluid into and out of the blood on both sides of the capillary bed. That's going to be different than lymphatic capillaries. In our lymphatic capillaries, all that fluid out here is going to push in through these little mini valves that are created by that shingle-like arrangement of cells, and then when the fluid pushes back, it's going to snap that valve shut. So lymphatic capillaries are different in a couple ways, and that's going to be one, is that they have this shingle-like arrangement of overlapping of their cells that creates these mini valves. So the cells overlap like shingles. This creates mini valves that allow for one-way movement of fluid into the capillary, but then not movement of fluid back out. So they create mini valves that prevent the backflow of fluid. So that's going to to be another difference. They originate as closed-ended tubes. And we'll say they originate as closed-ended tubes in a normal capillary bed. Okay, so as soon as the fluid enters our lymphatic capillaries, it's now going to be called lymph. So our lymph is going to be collected in our lymphatic capillaries. Lacteals I mentioned a moment ago in helping with the function of lipid absorption. Lacteals are specialized lymphatic capillaries that absorb lipids from the small intestine. Okay, and they're going to drain into this structure called the cisterna chyli. So, all right, our lymphatic capillaries are going to converge into larger vessels called collecting vessels, or lymphatic collecting vessels. Some books just call these lymphatic vessels. But our collecting vessels are going to drain our lymphatic capillary beds, and they're actually going to run past lymph nodes. So these are larger vessels. They contain valves like our veins did. They drain our lymphatic capillaries. And they run past lymph nodes. So they're going to drain into lymphatic trunks. We don't have a lymphatic lab. I'm not going to make you worry about memorizing your lymphatic trunks. So our lymphatic trunks will say drain our lymphatic collecting vessels into one of two lymphatic ducts. So all of our lymphatic trunks are going to empty into one of two lymphatic ducts. We have the right lymphatic duct, and the thoracic duct. So it's really handy to have a full-size picture right now, but I don't want to infringe on anyone's copyrights. So we're going to look at Alex here. So your right lymphatic duct is going to drain the lymph from the right side of your head, neck, shoulder, your right arm, and the right side of your thorax, all into your right subclavian vein. Your thoracic duct is running up by your aorta, behind or posterior to your aorta back here, and behind your small intestines back here is where we would see that enlarged cisterna chyli. So we don't have our lymphatic vessels on this model, but the enlarged cisterna chyli is here. It's going to absorb those lipids and then drain into the thoracic duct. So the thoracic duct runs superiorly and posterior to the aorta, and then drains into the left subclavian vein. So what that means about all of the fats that you ingest is that they hit all of the blood vessels pretty much everywhere before they make it to the liver, and the liver can do something with it. So lipids then are going to drain into your left subclavian vein. Venous blood is on its way back to the heart to go to the lungs for nutrient and gas exchange, pick up oxygen, gets pumped back to the heart, and now that oxygenated, fat-rich blood hits all of your arteries on the way back to the liver. It's pretty crazy. It's a pretty crazy thing. So our thoracic duct is going to empty the trunks that serve like 75% of the body. So the thoracic duct empties the trunks from your about 75% of the body, and the cisterna chyli. Cisterna into the left subclavian vein. Your right lymphatic duct empties the trunks from your the right side of your head, neck, your right shoulder, arm, your right thorax, into your right subclavian vein. So here can be my little figure here. Oh wow, really disproportion. So the right lymphatic duct is going to drain all of this into the right subclavian vein, and the thoracic duct is going to drain all of the rest of this and those lipids from the lacteals into the cisterna all right into your left subclavian vein. That's artistry there, people. I'm going to keep that up as long as possible. Okay. So here's a question for you. What part of the lymphatic system is most closely associated with capillary beds? A, lymphatic capillaries, B, lymph nodes, C, lymphatic ducts, D, lymphatic trunks. Easy peasy pumpkin pie, these publisher questions. The answer is lymphatic capillaries. So, lymph is originating. It starts out here as what was extracellular fluid, and then it's going to push onto those lymphatic capillary cells and become lymph that's flowing in our lymphatic capillaries. Okay, I already told you this. Why are we talking about this? Well, because our lymphatic capillaries are going to drain into collecting vessels, which are larger vessels that have valves which prevent the backflow of lymph. And these are going to become afferent vessels that are going to drain into a lymph node. So this is a lymph node. It's got an outer cortical region out here that's got these things called germinal centers. Germinal centers have a high supply of macrophages and some B and T cells. And then this is the inner medulla that's going to drain away into efferent vessels. So afferent vessels empty lymph into lymph nodes. And then our lymph nodes are going to drain into efferent vessels that take the lymph away. Now these efferent vessels can go and become the afferent vessel for the next lymph node. So that's possible. So just be aware of that. Those are all of our larger lymphatic collecting vessels. So for the flow of lymph, it's going to be transported through our collecting vessels. Afferent vessels are going to empty the lymph into lymph nodes that will drain into efferent vessels that may or may not become afferent vessels for the next lymph node. All of our lymph nodes are going to drain into our efferent vessels. All of our vessels are going to drain into lymphatic trunks. All of our lymphatic trunks are going to drain into lymphatic ducts. And now that fluid that is drained into the subclavian veins is lymph when it leaves the ducts and becomes blood plasma now as it mixes with blood in the subclavian veins. So we go from our afferent vessels, from our collecting vessels. So if I wanted to write out another pathway here, I could say from my collecting vessels to my lymphatic trunks, and then from my lymphatic trunks to my lymphatic ducts. All through here it was lymph, and now these are going to drain into my subclavian veins, and this fluid will mix and become one with blood plasma. All right. Ooh-wee. Here's another question. All lymph is eventually returned to the circulation via what? A, the aorta, B, the vena cava, C, the subclavian veins, D, the pulmonary trunk. The answer is the subclavian veins. We're going to talk about the lymphoid cells a lot more in the next chapter with the immune system, but right now let's just have a little bit of a brief introduction. So our cells that are involved in immunity in some way are our T cells and our B cells. Our T cells are involved in what's called cell-mediated immunity. And it's because the T cells are doing the stuff that gives us the immunity, and this protects against intracellular pathogens. And then we have B cells. These are lymphocytes that are involved in what's called humoral immunity. And humoral immunity protects against extracellular pathogens. So these are the lymphocytes that are the specific cells we've talked about when we talked about blood and things. These are involved in specific immunity. Our other important lymphoid cells, macrophage and dendritic cells, are innate cells that are phagocytic, meaning they gobble stuff up. And then some other important lymphoid cells are the supporting cells, the reticular cells that secrete reticular connective tissue. So if you remember from last semester, we said really the only place we find reticular connective tissue in high concentration is in lymphoid organs. This is what we're talking about. And that reticular connective tissue is made of the same stuff as collagen, remember, but it's arranged in a different way so that we can form a nice mesh network or stroma for our lymphoid organs. So reticular connective tissue forms that, this nice internal skeleton, and it's the reticular cells that secrete that. So these are cells that produce our reticular connective tissue. And reticular connective tissue forms the stroma of our lymphatic organs. Okay. Well, what are our lymphatic organs? We break them down into two classes. Our primary organs, which are involved in the production and maturation of lymphocytes, the specific ones. And our secondary organs, which are involved in some other way in housing those lymphocytes or in doing something else with the immune system. So everything else. Everything else in the lymphatic system is a secondary organ. So our primary organs are involved in the production and maturation of our lymphocytes. And our secondary organs are everything else. So what are our primary organs? Where do all cells originate? The red bone marrow, so that's a primary organ. And our T cells actually have to be trained to reach maturity. To become immunocompetent, they've got to go off to the thymus for what's called positive and negative selection. So that's also, the thymus is also a primary organ. So our red bone marrow, which is going to produce both our T cells and our B cells, and then our thymus, which is the site of T cell maturation. Okay, so primary organs, red bone marrow and thymus, secondary organs, everything else. function is to filter lymph. So the lymph that's brought in from those collecting vessels is going to filter past these germinal centers, and if there's anything in them that we need to pull out, we can do it here. If there's any kind of antigen in there and we need to start an immune response, we can do that here. So we'll see in the next chapter, in the inflammatory response, we produce a bunch of extracellular fluid, a lot more. So that becomes a lot of lymph, or it's called exudate when it washes the wound. And that's going to drain into our lymphatic capillaries and run past our lymph nodes. So if I get a cut on my finger and I introduce a bacteria, I can wash that bacteria into a lymphatic capillary that's ultimately going to lead into a vessel that's going to run past a lymph node. So if there's a bacteria in here, then I can run it past here where I've got macrophages. They can become antigen-presenting cells and present it then to the B cells that are hanging out here too. So that's really, really cool. The lymph nodes filter lymph, and they provide a site for immune system activation. Another thing is that they provide a site for immune cell proliferation. This is different than the first time lymphocytes are produced. Their origin in the bone marrow is one thing, but if you're going to proliferate and make a whole bunch of cells that are specific to something that you're fighting, that's going to be proliferation, and that can happen in your lymph nodes. It also happens in your tonsils, and that's happening because you have an increase in lymphocyte number as you're mounting an immune response. So we could say they provide a site for immune system activation, but they also provide a site for lymphocyte proliferation. So they're a site for lymphocyte proliferation. Welcome to Coronavirus Classroom, Nighttime Editing Edition. So sometimes in the coronavirus classroom, you long ago thought you were done working, and then you're editing the video and realize that your camera stopped recording. So here I am, maybe with some wine, maybe with some chocolate, maybe ready for bed, and apparently my projector is even in the mood for sleep because it's a little blue. We're going to go with it. Talk about the structure and location of lymph nodes. I'm not really going to eat this chocolate while I'm talking to you, but lymph nodes, as you'll see in a moment, are going to be filtering our lymph. And so the structure of them is that they kind of look like this. And so we'll have a whole lot of afferent collecting vessels draining into lymph nodes past this outer cortex region that has these things called germinal centers. So this outer region of a lymph node is called the cortex, this inner region is called the medulla, and it's going to drain away into efferent vessels that will then become some afferent vessel for some lymph node on down the line. And so afferent vessels are going to lead into lymph nodes, which have this structure of having an outer cortex that has germinal centers. These germinal centers contain macrophages that can gobble up any, say, bacteria or anything that might have gotten washed into exudate and then picked up in lymphatic capillaries. So that's kind of their structure. So the macrophages are there, and there are also lymphocytes there. So again, what's going to happen is as we're washing a wound, you'll see in the inflammatory response, as we're washing a wound, we're going to make a lot of extracellular fluid and pick that up into these lymphatic capillaries that can drain past lymph nodes. So the other really cool thing about lymph nodes, and truly this is really why I came back to lecture, otherwise I would have just left what I had. But I didn't talk about before the location that we find our lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are at some pretty regularly prescribed intervals. We've got brachial lymph nodes here in your arm, axillary lymph nodes here in your axillary region. You've got some lymph nodes throughout your thoracic cavity, inguinal lymph nodes in the inguinal region, popliteal lymph nodes in your knee. And so what's cool about this is that they're kind of at these regular intervals along pathways in your body that, you might regularly expose to potential injury. So you use your hands a lot. So if you cut your hand and you have your inflammatory response going on there, we can wash that wound and then drain it into these lymphatic capillaries that will drain into the lymphatic collecting vessels that will wash past our lymph nodes, so we can start an immune response there if we need to. So, the thing about our lymph nodes and lymphatic nodules and lymphoid tissue in general is that it can be kind of different from person to person. So there are definite places where we can say in everyone we're going to find lymph nodes. So you would find them, you can find cervical lymph nodes around your neck and at the back of your head. So for locations, we'll say everybody's got cervical lymph nodes, everybody's got axillary and brachial lymph nodes, everybody's got various lymph nodes throughout the thoracic cavity, we've got inguinal lymph nodes, and we've got popliteal lymph nodes. Alright, I'm back to cut this and edit it into your lecture. See you soon. Circulation, our lymph is brought in through these afferent vessels, circulates past the cortex, drains into the medulla, and circulates out through an efferent vessel. Those are the lymph nodes. Okay, the spleen. The spleen is the largest lymphatic organ, and it functions to store red and white blood cells. And it filters blood. So, if you recall in the life cycle of an erythrocyte, we said at the end of its 120 days it begins to become rigid and is tested in test capillaries in the spleen. We said resident macrophages could gobble those erythrocytes up, and we would do whatever we did with the parts. Go back and look. You know what we did. So we can say it filters blood. The other thing that we'll say is that it stores red and white blood cells. Our red blood cells transport oxygen, our white blood cells give us immunity. This giving us immunity is what makes this a secondary lymphatic structure. The red pulp is where we find our red blood cells, and the white pulp is where we find our white blood cells. Our red pulp is associated with arteries. Our white pulp is associated with veins. And if we think about that, that kind of makes sense. If we're going to release some red blood cells, we want to get them out to our arteries where we're going to then increase our oxygen availability and bring this oxygen to the tissues. If we're going to bring in white blood cells, maybe we don't want it moving through so fast, so we'll put our white blood cells into our veins. Pretty cool stuff, this body we have. Okay, the strange thing about lymphatic tissue is that it's kind of dispersed, and you can find lymphatic nodules kind of all over the place associated with mucous membranes. And those nodules are like little clusters of lymphatic tissue, similar to lymph nodes, but just not quite as big and as highly organized. So the diffuse kind of tissue that we find all over the place is called MALT, or mucosal associated. So mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. And now this is going to be associated with your mucous membranes. So the three sets of tonsils that are distinct outside your oral mucosa are the pharyngeal tonsil, that's superior at the back of your kind of oropharynx, and then your palatine tonsils, those are the ones that you can kind of see the swelling of if you've got swollen tonsils when you're young, and then just inferior to that are the lingual tonsils. So the tonsils are monitoring the mucus that's coming in from your nasal and oral cavity, and so we could kind of say that's their big function. Our tonsils monitor our mucus and saliva from the nasal The pharyngeal tonsil is the most superior tonsil. Make sure you look at the model figures in your lab for that. You can also see them in your book. The pharyngeal tonsil is monitoring the nasal cavity. And then your palatine and lingual tonsils sit at the back of your oral cavity. So your palatine tonsils and lingual tonsils are really monitoring your saliva. So these are in your posterior to your oral cavity and monitoring your saliva. Okay? Little aggregates of tissue, little nodules that we find surrounding the small intestine are called Peyer's patches. And again, it's just acting as a site for lymphatic activation if we need to. You can start an immune response there if you ingest something and a pathogen is trying to come into your body through the material in your small intestine. We can deal with it in Peyer's patches. So these are aggregates of lymphoid tissue surrounding the small intestine. Your appendix is actually considered a secondary lymphatic organ. So your appendix hangs off of your large intestine. Your appendix actually stores white blood cells. So in animals that eat grass, it's still a digestive organ, but for us it doesn't really do a whole lot. We consider it a vestigial organ. There are some white blood cells though. So what happens is material is coming in through this ileocecal region. It can back up into the appendix. Here it is. So this is the appendix right here, and as material is coming through, it can back up into the appendix and start an immune reaction and you get appendicitis. So the appendix just stores some white blood cells. All right, so thymus. This is a primary organ, and that's because this is the site of T-cell maturation. So the thymus is the last organ we're going to talk about. It is really, really important in kids, and it's really big. It sits here superior to the heart and is really cellular, and the T-cells are learning how to do their thing. Kids have to develop what's called the T-cell repertoire. In adults, the thymus gets overtaken by adipose tissue or involuted, so models don't even really show it. So as far as the structure, we're just going to not even really worry about it. The function is that it helps with T-cell maturation. So this is, or it is the site of T-cell maturation. So it's the site of T-cell maturation. So this is where T-cells go and learn to, well, we see, can they recognize antigen at all? And then do they respond to self-antigen? So those are the two questions that are asked in the thymus, and we'll talk about that with the immune system and T-cell maturation. All right, I've got a quick question for you. Which of the following is not a function of lymphatic vessels? A, transportation of absorbed fat to the bloodstream. B, delivery of nutrients to the tissues. C, return of excess fluid to the bloodstream. D, return of leaked proteins to the bloodstream. Which of the following is not a function of lymphatic vessels? B is not a function of lymphatic vessels. This is a function of the cardiovascular system and the normal capillaries we find there. All right, that wraps up the lymphatic system. It's been fun. Stay safe.